There's so many questions people have on halacha, chinuch, relationships, mental health, marriage, hashkafa, and everything in between. Every 2 weeks, I discuss them with senior dayanim of the Kehilas Federation. I'm Mena Reisner, and you're listening to Asking for a Friend. Welcome to episode 3 in our chinuch series on Asking for a Friend. Before we start, many thanks for all your feedback and questions sent in. We'll be addressing them in future episodes, Mitzvah Shem. Please make sure to subscribe. New episodes are released every 2 weeks and you don't want to miss them. This episode is with Dayan Yosef Posen. Dayan Posen grew up in London, learnt in Shaarei Torah in Manchester, followed by Pesach, Mir, Brisk, and received his dayanis 20 years ago from Reb Naftali Nussbaum and Reb Baruch Schrager and others. He served as a dayan on the Golders Green Kadassia Basin for 9 years, and then on the Kehilas Federation Basin, where he is currently a dayan and is heavily involved with Dinei Torah, Gittin, Mediation, and Kashrus. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about sibling rivalry. Sibling rivalry is as old as human history, yet it remains one of the most sensitive, complicated dynamics inside any family. It can sometimes look small on the surface, who gets more attention, who feels overlooked, but it often reflects something much deeper about personality, parenting, and the way children perceive fairness at home. In this episode, we're looking at sibling rivalry through a halachic, emotional, and practical lens. Why does it arise? Is it genuinely more common today? How should parents think about differences between their children? And what happens when those differences lead to tension or hurt? And for siblings themselves, what helps, what harms, and what can still be repaired years down the line? It's a topic that sadly touches many homes and at every stage of life, which is why it's so important to understand how these dynamics form and how they could be guided in a healthier direction. Dayan Posen, as an accredited commercial and family mediator with decades of working with complicated family disputes, I wanted to discuss today a range of issues that you've no doubt had much experience with. So let me just start with the most basic question. What is the main cause of sibling rivalry today?
So the main cause of sibling rivalry today is the same as it always was. Maybe we can rephrase that question. What is it about sibling rivalry that is so heated and so loaded more than regular rivalry? People get jealous all the time. What is it about siblings that makes it so powerful? And I think the answer to that is what children crave the most is their parents' love and attention. That's what's really the most important thing to them growing up. And therefore, to an extent, children, siblings, are fighting for their parents' attention, for their parents' accolade, for their parents' recognition. And sometimes, subconsciously, unintentionally, it can almost become a competition. Therefore, when one sibling sees that their fellow sibling seems to be getting more attention than their parent, seems to be more loved than the parent, seems to always be getting compliments when they always feel they're getting told off, then that itself means that the aspect that is most important to them, their parents' love, their parents' recognition, is being stolen by their sibling, so to speak. And that is something that goes to a core of a child's stability, core of a child's self-worth. And that's what makes sibling rivalry have all the ingredients to make it so much more powerful and heated than any other form of rivalry.
If I'm understanding Dayan correctly, the difference between, let's say, a fallout with a friend is that it doesn't necessarily reflect on you as much. It doesn't reflect on a person's identity in the same way. As opposed to parents' recognition and love, there's an inherent part of us that craves it and needs it, and when we feel we've been slighted by that, that can have a much more damaging effect.
Yes, so really, I sometimes say, a home is meant to be a miklot. A home is a safe space where no matter what happens in the outside world, if I may say even no matter what happens in school, children come home to be recharged. They come home to receive a hug and cookies. And they come home to that visual, physical, or emotional embrace by their parent. If they feel that's being taken away from them, deprived from them, because someone else who's vying for that limited, so to speak, hug, then they get very defensive and they get very jealous. Jealousy is a core midah, it's a core trait that needs to be worked on. And children from a young age, on their safe space in their home, if they feel that what's most important to them is being taken away, deprived to them because of their nearest and dearest, and that's potentially a betrayal, it's potentially something that makes deep-rooted scars.
So, as you said, parents have, or alluded to, parents have a limited bandwidth, right? We're not superhuman, we're not supernatural, we can't love indefinitely. Only Hashem can. We're limited beings. I think most people who would ask their parents, do you have a favorite? The parents would deny that, right? It's a very common thing for children to ask. And yet, if you ask most people in the world, who was your parents' favorite, they would instantly be able to tell you. I think just on a human level, it doesn't necessarily mean that they love a child more. They would do the same for every child, let's say. But there's certain personality traits that parents are attracted to, whether it's of their own, whether it's the opposite of their own. But there's certain things that make one child easier to love than another. That being the case, and if children can pick up on it, and I think we know that children can, what should a parent do to control the feelings of love for one child? And I say love in a large way, of favoritism, of similarity that they might have, which can no doubt cause some effect of sibling rivalry.
There's a fascinating Siparna who explains that Yaakov Avinu, and when speaking about others, we always have to be careful, but we're meant to learn limudim from them. Yaakov Avinu loved Yosef more than the other brothers, that's Mefurish Pasuk. But the Siparna says, what, if one can say, was the mistake of Yaakov Avinu, was putting that extra love into action.
Ksonis Pasim.
By giving him Ksonis Pasim. And says, if you look at the way the Psukim follow, it was when he gave them the Ksonis Pasim and he made it official that Yosef was the favorite. That's what caused that the brothers couldn't handle it and they hated him. Says the Siparna, the mistake was allowing the extra love he had in his heart to come out in his actions. So to come back to your question, we are human. We would all like to think we love all our children the same. And many parents maybe do. But clearly wouldn't be correct to say all parents do. And definitely, as you put it, from children's perspective, that's not the case. Although children's perspective can often be wrong. Sometimes parents don't realize that their children see things differently than they would like them to see. So the Siparna is saying, you can't affect the feeling you have in your heart, but you can affect the actions that you do. So really, signs of favoritism manifesting themselves in actions is what Siparna says we have to keep away from. In fact, I was once involved in a fascinating case. There was a couple, Holocaust survivors, who had a number of children. And then they had a Ben Zakunim, they had a child born in their old age. And this Ben Zakunim was an excellent son. He took them out for coffee, he took them out for walks, he had all the time in the world for them. His siblings didn't have so much time, didn't spend so much time with their parents. And the parents recognized that this youngest child was the apple of their eye, but they were appreciative of the time and attention and devotion he gave them. And I think if they would have been honest with themselves, they were not happy with other children. So they wrote a will, and in the will, which I was not involved in, and in the will, they wrote that when the husband dies first or the wife dies first, whoever dies first goes to a surviving spouse. But when the second spouse dies, everything goes to the children to be divided equally. But they left something extra, almost equivalent to what every child received, to this youngest child. The will and Savor was read the morning after the Shiva. And at that stage, remarkably, all the other siblings cut off all contact with their mother. So their father was Nifta, sat Shiva, read the will, cut off all contact from them and their children from their mother. And that was, unfortunately, the stage that I was contacted by their local Rav to say, can you come in and try and mediate something here? And it's just a strange story in any case because nothing had actually happened. Everything had gone to the mother. So you would have thought that, on the contrary, the children would be more savvy. But that's what happened. And the mother was complaining, after all I've been through, the Holocaust and everything. And now this is how my children should treat me. And I asked her, what was intended to happen? You singled out this child for a big hurrah, right? Was the intention hakaras hatoiv? Because there would have been a much easier way to do that. Giving that money on the side, no one has to know about it, and everyone's a winner. My personal take on it was that this was meant to make a statement, and it absolutely achieved its purpose. The trouble was that the father who made this statement moved on to Olam Ha'emes, and he left behind an almana who had to pay the price.
Well, that is a tragic story even. But does that mean that one has to treat all children equally? Like even in a tzavah? What happens if one I mean, in this case, it's one helped a parent a lot more, which is very, very common, especially in a youngest child with more energy, and he grew up with older parents, so he looks at them as old people from his teenage years as opposed to the other children. But even if another child potentially needs more help, there's many times a family where a couple of them are very affluent, a couple of them are very poor, and there's literally both ends of the spectrum. Are parents expected to treat all children equally in a will?
So that's also a very interesting point. The Gemara in Shabbos brings from the Machlokes of Yosef and Yaakov and Shvatim that Al Yashane Adam Ben Abonim, a person shouldn't differentiate between children. When the Rambam brings this halacha, he says in a person's lifetime. The Torah brings this halacha in Hilchos Nachlas, seeming to imply that this only applies to writing a will. And the Shulchan Aruch doesn't bring this halacha at all. And some of the commentaries ask, why does he miss it out? No one really has an answer. From my own personal experience, I can understand why it might be that there's something especially potentially damaging in doing this in a will. There's something unique about a will, that it's almost like the parents' last words written on their own matzeva, what they think about their children. Pick your example. If a child needs help and the parents help that child along the way, and ideally if they can do it without making a big noise about it, hopefully the child has a sensitivity not to make a big noise about it, not always. In that case, fine, you're helping your child because he needs help. That's what parents are for. But when a person writes a will or tzava and differentiates between the siblings, that creates huge machlokes. And you shouldn't think for a moment that because one child doesn't need the money, they're going to take it on the chin, because in reality it's often got very little to do with how much money a person needs, and more to do with what they think as siblings, as children, they're entitled to, and that their parents are treating them different from each other.
Fascinating. The Dayan's saying it's emotional. It's not financial at all.
Very much. Very, very much.
So in other words, that's that child who should really, let's say a non-well-off sibling would think, how's it possible that my sibling can't accept the fact that I would need more money? And you're saying that that person's missed the boat. It's nothing to do with the money at all.
Correct. It's not to do with the money. It's to do with my status as your child. Am I different than my siblings? And you can't rationalize it. It's just, that's the way it's taken. So
that being the case, even in a person's lifetime, if they have children and some of them are better off than the others, and it comes to helping out chasnas, for example, or gifts, should the parents be conscious to ensure that all siblings get the same? Because, as the Dayan is saying, it's not about the money.
No, because I think that this last point is specifically when it comes to a will or tzava. There's something unique about that. I think parents are there to help their children when they can, and if their children need it, as they need it. And therefore it would be a mistake to try to be politically correct to such a level that you're not helping one child who you can help just because you didn't help the other child who didn't need it. But I would say, as I said before, it doesn't have to be everyone's knowledge. Not everyone has to be following who's given what. It's an interesting phenomena that children seem to think that their parents are spending their Yerusha. As long as parents are alive and well, the money belongs to them to do with as they wish. But sometimes it's better that the children don't necessarily know exactly what's happening.
So that would be regarding a will. But generally, what would the Dayan say about when bring one's children up? Is one always expected to treat them all the same? In day-to-day parenting, I mean, is it even realistic that, given their very different personalities, given children's different needs, should one try and always have this boxed in, this is how I treat all my children? Is it even realistic to expect that?
I think that would be a big mistake. By definition means every child is different. Every child needs to be treated and dealt with in a tailor-made fashion. I think that, pick an extreme, imagine parents who have a special needs child. So that child is going to require, whether physically or mentally, extra help, extra time. And there's nothing you can do about that. That's the reality. It'd be wrong to try and say that parents have to have exactly the same time spent with each child. However, it's also true to say that if a child doesn't need that much of the parent's attention, and they have a sibling who needs a lot of parents' attention, then parents have to try and find opportunities to spend one-on-one time with that child who doesn't have the special requirements. Otherwise, you're on the risk they may resent their sibling for taking so much of their parents' attention from them. And for some parents, this is a real struggle because, we're speaking here in the theory, but in the practice, many times mothers might be holding down jobs as well as being mothers, as well as running homes, and fathers are doing the same. And there's only so much time in the day, and it's difficult. It's a real challenge. But if one is aware to try and make sure there's some kind of
balance.
Balance would be the wrong word even, because it's never going to be a balance, but some kind of recognition of the fact that this other child isn't getting the same attention as their sibling, and therefore do something special. I know someone close to me, I won't say their name, and I don't think the schools would like this idea, someone in a different country. When his kids were growing up, once a month on Rosh Chodesh, he would take a different child out of school, and he would tell that child, today I'm devoted to you, go wherever you want. They'd go to the zoo, they'd go hiking, they'd do whatever it would be. Like I say, not something necessarily recommended, and I'm sure the schools wouldn't appreciate it. But one thing I can tell you is those kids, when they grow up, they will remember those days that they spent with their father.
There's a Choshva Rav I'm close to in Yerushalayim who told me that he's got a lot of children, Kainora. He told me that every week he spends an hour with each child on rotation. And he said that's the best chinuch advice he can give. So the Dayan is saying some very practical advice that even if the day-to-day could be overwhelming with a certain child, there's always an opportunity to take one out one-on-one time.
Let me tell you how far that goes. But did you have a you know, Chazal say if a person zeichet to Anecdote, if a person zeichet to a wife with being a Sarah, they're more intuitive, especially in these kind of areas. So I once came home, and it was a busy day, as it often is, and my wife asked me if I'd go out to pick up something from a local shop. And one of my sons was younger at the time, and he asked if he could come with, and without even thinking, I said no. And the reason why I said no is because I intended making a private call in the car on the way. And I went to the shop, came back, and in the right moment, and obviously not in front of the children, my wife asked me, why did you say no? And I said, well, it's just a local shop, it's not a big deal, it's not very exciting, I'm just going to a shop, so, you know, what was the whole... So my wife said to me, you're making a mistake. You think, does our son want to come with because is the local shop exciting or not exciting? He wants to come with because he wants to go with his father. And going with his father, sitting in the car next to him, he's old enough to kind of just go in the front, sit in the car, and then when he comes to the till, maybe his father will have less resilience than his mother, and if he asks him whether he can have that chocolate, maybe his father will let him. That's exciting for a child. And she was 100% right. I just hadn't, in the hubbub of life, I hadn't paused to reflect on that powerful point that we're not talking about taking your kids to Orlando. We're talking about finding individual time, as you say, for each child. One-on-one time, me time, when a child can talk and they feel that their parent wants to listen and is listening to what they have to say. That's really what it's about.
We would like to thank Moshe and Chaya Feldman for their continued sponsorship of this podcast. This week's has been dedicated to Lil Nishmas Moshe's father, Rabbi Yitzchak Ephraim ben Rabbi Yehuda Avram Eber, whose first yahrzeit was last week. Dayan Posen, you knew Rabbi Yitzchak personally, right?
Yeah, sure. Rabbi Yitzchak, Zichron Livracha, was a Yid who was Osek B'Tzorchei Tzibur 24/6. Many people in town owe him a debt to Hakaras Hatov that they don't even know about. Rabbi Yitzchak was a person who was Marbe Shalom whatever he could, and I'd say that what gave him simcha above all was his shurim that he was zeicha to give in his last years, and most importantly the Yiddish nachas he got from his children's Avodas HaKodesh. So it's very appropriate that it's his children who are sponsoring Le'ilu Nishmosei this episode, which will hopefully promote Shalom in Klal Yisrael.
I think, like you say, that life's distraction sometimes doesn't allow us to focus. It's something we probably know intuitively. And I guess the same could be said about marriage. With the chaos of everyday life, and you sometimes realize you haven't actually sat down and spoken to to a wife in months, then being conscious of the fact that you need to carve out the time is already a big step. But I just wanted to come back to comparisons. I think a scenario that most parents can relate to is the Shabbos meal. So every child comes home with their bag of different questions and Divrei Torah, and it's very likely that one child will be more academically gifted than another, a better memory, a better grasp of the questions. You'll have the one child who goes through the whole Sedra sheet, knows everything backwards, will know the bonus questions. And you'll have another child who gets absolutely everything wrong, maybe even worse, maybe reading difficulties while the other sibling soars. How are parents supposed to manage that? Because you do want your child who does very well to know that you appreciate that. A child should know he's gifted from his parents. On the other hand, should a parent be very conscious when they compliment? What's the other child feeling? Should they try and make a big deal of the one question they get right? It's quite a complicated dynamic, which I think most parents can relate to.
Yes, so 100%. First of all, before we deal with the actual question, let's first appreciate the bracha that the Shabbos meal is. The Shabbos meal is an incredibly powerful tool in chinuch, in formal chinuch. It's meant to be, in a way, one of the highlights of every Jewish home. It's certainly meant to be one of the highlights of a child's experience growing up, from the point of view of all that noise and hubbub that's there in the week isn't there. And they have their parents, and they have their parents' attention and the ability to speak, laugh, sing, and enjoy quality time. So let's first appreciate that the Shabbos meal is an opportunity there for the taking, for those clever enough to take it. If one understands that, and then we come to your question, so yes, 100%. Some children come home with a sefer of questions. I mean, let's not even talk about Seder night, but that's a separate point. But some children come home with loads of questions on the parsha. Some children don't. Some children are extroverts, and they jump at the opportunity to answer their questions and everyone else's. And some children need prying and prodding to maybe answer some correctly, some incorrectly, etc. So first of all, let's also remember as parents, what are we trying to achieve with our children? We're trying to build them. Children are not there as badges of honor for parents to say, look at my son, look at my daughter. Children are entrusted to us from the Bnei Shalom to do the best that we can as Shutzvim with the Bnei Shalom, in giving those children the best opportunity to be the best people they can be. Now, once one understands that, then to come back to the question, it may well be the case that the Shabbos meal is not the right place to actually do those shilas. If it's going to end up with one child stealing all the time and attention and getting all the accolades, and especially if it means that a sibling is going to end up being embarrassed. If a sibling ends up being embarrassed at the Shabbos meal, that means they'll start dreading the Shabbos meal. It means that you're taking something which is a huge opportunity and you're turning it on its head, and instead making it something which a child resents and doesn't look forward to at all, which would be a terrible shame and a waste. So every parent has to know their children. And sometimes, yes, I definitely advise sit down at a different time, Erev Shabbos, before the meal, after the meal, Shabbos day, whenever it works, and do those questions. Obviously Bonim, some parents, depending on the age, struggle with how to fill the whole hour. Obviously Bonim, and just learning the text might be too much. So do the questions then. The children have one-on-one time with no one else interrupting. It's about building them. It's about letting them feel they can achieve. Some people do quizzes at the Shabbos table where they give tailor-made questions that fit the child's capabilities, and the child feels, yes, I can achieve. So 100%, it's got to be handled with seichel, and like every part of chinuch, you've got to know your kids, you've got to know yourself, and you've got to know what's achievable. And sometimes we'll get it wrong, and that's fine.
So I find it very interesting how the Dayan framed first looking at the Shabbos table, what it can achieve, what a highlight it is, which is vastly probably unappreciated, and then figure out from there how to make it work the best way, rather than going through the motions of, this is what we do at a Shabbos meal. We ask questions and then picking up the pieces later. I don't want to go off topic really, but in the same vein, many people invite Shabbos guests, which is a wonderful thing to do, and it's a mitzvah of acknowledgment. But keeping in mind what you said before about the focus being the time spent with children, should one be very conscious when having guests that the very special time spent with the children and the one-on-one time spent as a family unit could be filtered down because you have to entertain guests? Is that something a person should be conscious of?
Personally, I feel very strong about this, that whilst it's 100% correct, there's a mitzvah and it's important as part of chinuch as well, that children see the chesed done in the home. And Avraham Avinu brought the children into his achnos orchim. But in the lives we lead today, as we said, where often parents sometimes might not even see their children that much during the week because of when they go to sleep and when the parents come home from work or learning or whatever it may be. This is the oasis. This is the opportunity to strengthen that connection. Some people end up inviting guests where the adults sit around the table. I'm not even going to talk about the Lashon Hara, whatever things might get spoken about.
That's for our Lashon Hara series.
Yeah, exactly. And the children all go off, garden upstairs with the guests' children. And that's it. That's the whole Shabbos meal. I think that's a terrible shame. It's a huge wasted opportunity. When my children were growing up and were younger, then I only invited guests sparingly. And when I had them, it was only guests who would understand that I've got children and I have to speak to my children. My children would always sit next to me. The guest wouldn't usurp the child's position at the table. But forget, the guest comes and joins a family Shabbos meal. It's not that the guest replaces the family at the Shabbos meal. It shouldn't be, in my opinion. There's a time and place for everything. There's loads of opportunities to do chesed and achanas zorchim. But the Shabbos meal is for the family. Primarily, we think of our children as being home for so long, but the time flies. We have a small window of opportunity with our children. We have to maximize the opportunity. The world out there is competing with us. It's given different ideas, different insecurities, different challenges, and we have to chaperai and utilize every opportunity we have to make the most of it.
What would you say to parents who would push back on what the Dayan just said and would say that my whole week is busy with the children? I spend every waking moment come out with the children. In the evenings, I'm running out to learn, or the wife is working or taking care of the house because she couldn't when the kids were around. And Shabbos is just that time where I can have a bit of adult time or a bit of me time. And I enjoy socializing, and I don't get to socialize much. What would the Dayan say to that pushback?
I think that if I understood the question correctly, if a man is, for example, working hard in the office all week in order to support the family, that's of course something he's doing for the family, the same way as if, to use the stereotype position, the same as if a mother is cooking or doing other chores in the house, that's also for the family. But that's not what builds the relationship between the parents and the children. That's not what gives the children this informal chinuch. When a father comes home and he says, I want to tell you an unbelievable maisa that happened in work this week. I had a real nisayon, and it was difficult. And Baruch Hashem, I overcame it. And I saw the Yad Hashem, how everything fell into place. It was unbelievable. First of all, you're telling your child subconsciously, Daddy's human. Daddy can have challenges. You might struggle with those challenges. And look at this Siyata D'Shmaya that happened. And that impact on the child is so much more powerful than anything that happens from a Musa Drasha given over in school by a manal or in yeshiva. It's real. It's life experiences. And if instead you miss out on that, then it's a waste. It's a shame. Again, everyone has to, in order to be healthy parents, happy mothers, a happy child, you've got to know what you need. But love dafka doesn't have to happen at that moment.
Very interesting. I have no doubt that we'll get some feedback on this. And please do send them feedback to podcast@federation.org.uk. We'll say it again at the end. If we fast forward a few years and someone feels that they were treated unfairly compared to their siblings, how generally would the Dayan advise an adult who's struggling with their entire childhood, they were wronged, they were unfairly treated compared to their siblings? How do you move on from that?
It's a fascinating Rebbeinu and Ivashitz. When we speak about sibling rivalry, of course, the starting place in the Torah is the Shvatim. And Rebbeinu explains that the Pasuk says, Lo yochlu l'daber l'shalom. And he explains that in the Torah there's a love. You're not meant to hate your fellow brother in your heart. And at the same time, the Pasuk says, and he explains, sometimes a person feels aggrieved. They feel something happened that wasn't right, wasn't fair, someone's done something wrong to them. Means don't keep it bottled up inside you. For a number of reasons. First of all, sometimes the person might not realize they've done something that's hurt you in such a way, that you've taken in such a way. And when you air that to them in the correct manner, and they realize, they may apologize, and that can put that matter, so to speak, to bed. They may have actually not intended anything like that at all, and sometimes, in most cases, there's been a misunderstanding. The person thinks one thing's happened, really something else has happened. So Rebbeinu says that the challenge with the Shvatim is they weren't able to say anything, because this is what Yaakov did, and that was it. But in real life, if a person feels aggrieved, and they feel there might be a benefit in bringing it up, if there's no one to talk to, there's no one to talk to. But if there might be a benefit in bringing it up in a calm manner, then that can be huge, because sometimes, like we say, the other person didn't mean it, didn't intend it, or actually didn't realize they did something wrong, but they did something wrong. But then you bring it up, and they can validate your feelings, and you can move on. It doesn't have to be baggage you carry around the rest of your life. There's a story I always say in mediation. You say it about an Englishman rather than someone from the killer, because that way people accept the story more. But that's just, we say Jack wakes up Sunday morning here in England. He's got two options. He's either going to mow the lawn or wash the car. In the winter, you can't wash the car, so you mow the lawn. So he wakes up Monday morning and he says to his wife, Sunday I'm going to mow the lawn. And then he remembers that his lawnmower is broken. So he says to his wife, oh, no problem. I'll go next door and ask John if I can borrow his lawnmower. But then he says, what happens if John won't lend me his lawnmower? He says, well, why shouldn't John lend me his lawnmower? I always lend him my bike, even though he always brings it back dirty. So I lent him my bike. Why wouldn't he lend me his lawnmower? And he goes next door and he smashes on the door. John comes running down and says, Jack, everything okay? He says, I don't even want your stupid lawnmower. Now, people laugh when they hear the story. We see this in Bezdin and for sure in mediation on a regular basis. People have a way of filling in the dots. When you see something happen, you've got a way to interpret it. We have a mitzvah, don chavschus, but often in real time that doesn't happen. We fill in the dots, we think we know why it's happened, we think we know what they meant. That becomes a fact, and we build on that, gag, until you have a full-blown machlokes. You know, I'm a yekes, so I wash before Kiddush. Some people's minhag is they don't speak to their third cousins. They don't know why, but their parents didn't, their grandparents didn't. That's our family's minhag. We don't speak to the cousins, etc. Sometimes a person has to just allow himself to unpack all that historical baggage. Maybe it is based on something, maybe it isn't. Even if it is, does it have to carry the baggage that it carries, or can people move on? The same is true with sibling rivalry.
I think it's a very important point that the Dayan mentions, and we could probably broaden it out to most machlokes and most arguments that happen between people. I've always believed that most people think they are generally right in every scenario, and we know that every person's perspective is tainted by their biases, by their understanding of the situation. Does the Dayan generally, moving out of sibling rivalry for a moment, does the Dayan generally see that being true in mediation? Do you think that machloksim are mostly or very often based on pure misunderstandings of each other?
In Bezdin, we often say that, most in Torah don't get to experience a mahutadik gana for shotgun. We do find some talented people every now and then, but most times it's just a miscommunication, misunderstanding. People didn't realize they weren't on the same page or didn't even have a page. And then when things evolve and they have to try and work out what was the deal, what was the agreement, they fill in the dots in a way that works for them themselves. But often, you come to Bezdin, you have to listen when the one side says their case. We don't let you interrupt. And not only do you have to listen, how does this sound to the Dayanim who are impartial? And it's fascinating to see sometimes people for the first time actually hear where the other side's coming from. They might think the other side's completely wrong, but at least they get it. They hear, maybe that email wasn't as clear as I'd intended. Maybe actually there's something I missed. And sometimes disputes get resolved once each party's actually heard the other side vent and, state their case.
So just to bring that back to something we touched on before, does that mean that if a sibling feels wronged, is the correct approach always to air it, then keep it to oneself? Is there ever an advantage? Because I know the Dayan said that we shouldn't keep these things to ourselves. But is there ever an advantage of not airing all the grievances? Sometimes when people are very upset, they can say things that could potentially cause irreversible damage just to get it off their chest and to say all their pent-up feelings about this sibling, could be parent, for all these years. Or maybe there's some level of avoid samidus one can do, just working on oneself, trying to place it in a small corner of your heart and hoping it'll go away over time. Or is it always best to speak out?
So like most of these questions, there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. Chazal tell us the advantages of a person who's mavel midosov, a person who swallows, takes one on the chin, takes one for the team, so to speak. But it depends on the person, really. If a person is able to just let it wash over him and move on, not take it to heart, of course that's an advantage. A person will lead a much happier life that way. But if a person isn't, and it's going to cause a deep-rooted pain and potentially sinner, then yes, don't bring it up at the time when you're absolutely furious. It's a well-known concept of sleeping on something, and the morning after, hopefully you've calmed down a bit, you'll be in a better position to deal with it. And the same goes with Shalom Bayis, potentially. But on the other hand, you have to know yourself, and you have to know the other parties. Sometimes a person has to consider their spouse's feeling. How do they feel about what the mishpacha has done to them? It's very nice a person being able to move it easily. If someone else may have been hurt, if one spouse may have been hurt by one sibling's behavior, etc., then you can't be a saint. You can't be a malach on someone else's expense.
Does anything change with a parent? We know that we have a mitzvah of kibbud over aim. One has to be very conscious about any pain caused to a parent. But let's say someone feels that all the issues they have in life are a result of one's parents acting a certain way. I'm sure the Dayan has come across many such people who blame their issues of parenting, and sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. But has the Dayan ever told someone to discuss it with a parent? Potentially, yes, it would make them feel better, but it can have other consequences too.
Sometimes you hear the Torah that makes you smile. A couple of years ago, there was a Torah that went around, again, on the Shrotim, where there was a boy in Cheder who asked his Rebbe, why is it that the Shvatim had so much sinner to Yosef when Yosef actually didn't do anything wrong? Yaakov is the one who gave him Ksenes Pasim. Why wasn't this sinner directed at Yaakov? And the Rebbe said, that's a very good question. I'm going to look up some Sorim. I'll come back to you tomorrow. Next day came to Cheder and he said, actually, I've looked up in all the Sorim and surprisingly no one speaks about this question, even though it sounds a fairly straightforward question. The parents on who favored the child. Why are you punishing the child? So the Rebbe took it up with his Rosh Hashiva, and Rosh Hashiva followed a similar path. I'll get back to you, but then came back to him and said, I'm stumped. And eventually found its way all the way up to Reb Chaim Kanievsky. And the question was asked, particularly, why does no one speak about this question? The question's a question, but what was even more puzzling was, none of the Mefarshim speak about this question. And Reb Chaim Kanievsky, with his brilliance, said, because until this generation, no one had this as a question. When a parent did an action, the children didn't question that action. You might resent the sibling, but you don't question why did the parent do it. It's today's generation where children can question parents, etc. So it's a very powerful observation from Chaim, but nevertheless we are in today's generation. So obviously anything between parents and children have to have the utmost respect and keep it over him. However, I have seen cases where children have brought up things that bothered them, things that clearly scarred them for many, many years, decades, that by bringing it up with the parent, often, as we said before, the parent didn't realize the way the child had taken it. The parent might have been going through whatever else they were going through at the time that was beyond the child's limited comprehension. And parents shouldn't always explain everything to children. Children don't need to know and shouldn't know everything that's going on with their parents. But nevertheless, the impact on the child was what it was. And by bringing it up to the parent in a respectful manner, the parent was able to validate those feelings. And it was remarkable, the weight that was lifted off the child's shoulder. To an extent, it was sad that it was so easy to do. It could have been done a while before. And sometimes in these situations, forgive me for being old-fashioned, I advise people to write a letter. There's something very powerful about a written letter. It's an art that's going out of fashion. First of all, I'm talking about writing with a pen on paper. Second of all, I'm talking about writing what you want to put onto paper, not what's being prompted to you. And writing one's feelings and giving it over. Sometimes in a conversation, a person isn't able to find the right words. They feel uncomfortable. It's awkward and they don't get the message out at all, or it doesn't come out right. A person gets to write something down and put it down in a letter, give it over. It can be read. It can be reread. It can be very, very powerful. It can be liberating to an extent. Sometimes, in extreme cases, I tell a person to write the letter that he would give his parent if he'd be able to. Even if he's not going to give it, it's like off their shoulder and it's in the drawer. But sometimes that message can come across and then a parent can write a letter back if they're not able to even have that one-on-one conversation. And it can be a huge relief to the child. Again, it doesn't always work out. You have to know the context.
It is very interesting how this weight can follow for so many years. And a person could potentially think that if nothing, we can't go back in time. Like, what's the point? Why should I even bring it up? And people might not realize the extent of how that burden can be lifted if they suddenly realize that they misunderstood their childhood. So moving on to later years in the siblings' life. So once they hopefully get married, then there's suddenly a spouse who comes into the picture. And many times a spouse could potentially be very helpful in resolving a conflict. Now you have someone who knows you very well, who can potentially help you think more objectively about this long-standing rivalry that a person has had with a sibling. And other times different. However you define the Anecdote in this case, that spouse could be very hurt and maybe overly validate their spouse's feelings and create an even greater rift, and all the hundreds of possible scenarios that can come out of this. But how often does the Dayan feel that a spouse has that positive or negative impact on sibling rivalry?
So I'll just answer that in a couple of different dimensions to the question. As a mediator, trying to get clear myself before I'm able to try and mediate any shalom, I first have to understand the real issues. Sometimes people struggle with being able to say what's really bothering them. Firstly, they're embarrassed because they're worried it might sound simple and making a fuss about nothing. And second of all, it might be so painful that they can't express it properly. And in those situations, sometimes if they are zeicha to have a spouse who's cued in to their emotions, they're able to shed light on what it is that they think their spouse is feeling, put into words in a way which make it easier to try and deal with. So that's from a mediation point of view. But to come back to answer your question primarily, there's an amazing Reb Chaim Shmulevitz who says that in the Machlekes of Korach, Eishes Ein Ben Peles, we don't even know her name, she's the wife of Ein Ben Peles, Owen came home and he was part of Korach's Ada, and she said to him, why are you involved in this machlekes? You're not going to be the one who comes out on top. It's either going to be Moshe Rabbeinu or it's going to be Korach. It's not going to be you. It's not worth it. So Chazal, from here we see that a woman's intuition builds a home. So Chaim Shnevetz asks the question, he says, what's the rocket science that we see? Out of all of Tanakh, this is the place that we see that a woman's intuition can build a home. What was so insightful in what she said? And he says that when we look at it now, we ask the question, in the heat of the moment, in the heat of the machlekas, particularly men often have a tendency to get caught up in it, especially if it's L'Shem Shamayim, then nothing like a machlekas L'Shem Shamayim. And we get caught up in it. And sometimes we need a Isha with Chochmah to say, is this really the way you're projecting or understanding it? Is this machlekas really worth it? What's this really all about? In fact, there's some husbands who don't discuss machlekas and they're involved in with their wives because they, quote unquote, won't understand, won't get it. What that really translates to is they'll get it too well. Right? So a person who's zeicha to Anecdote, who doesn't want machlekas and wants to try where one can, again, you can't be a doormat, you can't always allow yourself to be walked on, but to try and limit anything that might lead to machlekas is a lucky man. On the other hand, as you say, sometimes we have a Eishes Haman or Eishes Korach who winds up her husband's ego and is quick to point out every avla that she thinks her shrig has done or could have done, or favoritism that they did, provided to other siblings, etc. And when these things come to Bezdin, you can really see, and sometimes the wives come into Bezdin, you can really see what a person has been zeicha to receive.
There's a lot more to this discussion. I mean, just questions that come to mind of if a spouse is talking negatively about a sibling and potentially even starting a rift that never existed, and the other spouse has to balance between shalom bayis and falling out with family, but I think that's beyond the scope of this discussion. But talking generally about sibling rivalry and the extent of damage it can have, the Dayan has seen many cases over the years. How deep can the wounds of sibling rivalry go? In other words, can the rivalry itself shape someone's sense of self, their confidence? Can it affect a person's life in an extreme way?
100%. I think it's not just sibling rivalry, it's a relationship between a person and their parent growing up, of which sibling rivalry can be a large part of that equation. A person's sense of self-worth, a person's security is created as they grow as a child, the same way they grow physically, they grow emotionally, they grow in every area. And if they feel insecure growing up, if they feel a failure growing up, that impacts who they are. Reports at the end of a term, I don't know what they're like nowadays, but they used to have two columns. One was for effort, and one was for achievement. When I read my children's reports with them, they always brought the envelope and I opened it. Some brought it more excitedly, some I had to find out whether they got the reports. But I read it with them the first time, and I never looked at the achievement column in front of them. With them, I read through the effort column, because I think it's a basic in chinuch that you have to give a message to your child that I only want you to be the best that you can be. You know, we live in a world full of competition, and who comes top in the class and who comes bottom in the class, and etc., etc. It's unfair to expect a child to be more than what they can be. I want them to see, as important to me as whether they've tried. So they've tried their best, and you won't always achieve, you won't always hit the target that you want to, and that's fine. We fall, we pick ourselves up, that's all part of life. When they're not in front of me, I'll then read the achievement to know whether I think they're doing the maximum that they can achieve with the capabilities they've been given. But if a child grows up feeling that in my parents' eyes I'm a failure, just because I happen to have a sibling who more meets their idea of what a person should be, then that's hugely damaging for the rest of their life. I've come across people who you spend 1 minute, literally 1 minute, speaking to them, and you can see that they're shivering clee, they're insecure, they doubt themselves, they question their self-worth, and often it can be a result of the various things we've been discussing. And it's so sad, because sometimes with the right help, it could have been on the right track.
And as the Dayan is saying, if the power to do damage is so great, then the power to do good is equally as great. Just to end off, we've obviously discussed many of the issues that can come about due to sibling rivalry. If there are scars created by these issues that we've discussed, can it be helped or healed in some way? And as the Dayan had experience in that, So I know we discussed before when we feel children were wronged by their parents and how it could be helpful getting that burden off their chest and how healing that could be. But in terms of let's say the siblings themselves, these dynamics that are very, very heavily ingrained over the years, is there light at the end of the tunnel? Siblings haven't spoken in, could be 10 years. Can these things be corrected?
Again, sorry to keep repeating the old adage, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. It depends. Sometimes you can have a sibling who it would be toxic for them to have a relationship with their sibling because of how their sibling manipulates them, how their sibling makes them feel, how their sibling triggers various historic scars which then just get reopened again. So in that environment, no, it wouldn't be healthy for them to have that kind of relationship because it's just bringing up old pain again and causing a repeat of the damage. Sometimes a person might have gone through years of therapy to try to do damage limitation on what they went through as a child, and then to make them force them into a relationship which would be steps backwards would not be the right thing. But sometimes, as we said before, if really these things have just evolved based on misconceptions, potential misconceptions, and even if they weren't misconceptions, but were they big enough to really cause the split that they've caused, or did that just happen by itself and was allowed to continue happening because everyone was too proud to make the first step? And sometimes you need an Aaron HaKohen to come along and sow the seeds, at least for the next generation, that this doesn't have to be the Messiah of this family, that we have this machlokas. And for some people, remarkably, it's such a relief when that weight is taken off their shoulders.
And people don't even realize the burden they've been carrying.
They don't, correct?
Well, thank you very much. I think that brings this episode to an end. I found it very powerful. Sometimes we can look at children as children instead of looking at them as young, developing adults. And as well as all the damage that can chas v'shalom be done, there's so much one can invest and the ishtadlus one can do. And I found what the Dayan said before about Shabbos, definitely something that is underappreciated generally. So thank you, and please send all questions or feedback to podcast@federation.org.uk, and we would look forward to addressing them in a future episode. Thank you, Dayan Posen.
Thank you very much.